We've heard a lot of talk about this wide receiver class. We are going to break down our top 15 wide receiver rookie rankings in tier-based format. There's a lot to sort through. There's a lot to unpack. I'm sure a lot of you guys that have rookie drafts going fast and furious right now have no idea which second-round pick wide receiver you want to spend on. So we're going to aim to tackle that question and more in today's video. We did running backs, we did quarterbacks and tight ends already yesterday. So if you guys want to go check out those rookie rankings videos, you can. If you want access to all of our rankings, dynasty, rookie, all that good stuff is available, flockfantasy.com, using the promo code FSE. You get a 2-day free trial, 30% off all packages. But without further ado, Danny, how you doing?
Doing well. And yeah, you guys would have saw us already attack the running back position as well as the quarterback and tight ends video, but we get into our favorite position personally in Dynasty, these young stud upcoming wide receivers. And we saw 4 of them go in the first round of the NFL draft. How do they stack up at the top of this tier list? How do some of those day 2 options, day 3 options potentially stack up? You guys will find all of that and more in today's video. But with that being said, let's get right into it.
All right, so as you talked about before the intro, I think because these guys all went in the first round, everybody kind of knows that these guys should be wide receivers 1 through 4 in rookie drafts in some order. We'll break them down, of course, talk about their cases and their new fits and their new landing spots. But I really do want to spend the bulk of this video breaking down that large mega tier of wide receiver 4s that all got day 2 draft capital, because I'm sure a lot of you guys have no idea which order to rank them in, which order to draft them in rookie drafts. So let's start with the wide receiver 2s. And basically these tiers on the left mean their rank amongst all dynasty wide receivers. So Jaxon Smith-Njigba right now is currently my wide receiver 13, Jordan Addison, my wide receiver 18, and Quentin Johnston, my wide receiver 24. So all of those guys are wide receiver 2s in dynasty for me. We talked about this before we started recording. Is Quentin Johnston in this tier, or is it just JSN and Jordan Addison in this tier? Because they're both in my top 20. Quentin Johnston just outside of that. I'll let you kind of break down that dynamic, and then we'll get into the actual players.
Yeah, so the way I have it currently is that JSN is my wide receiver 13 overall in Dynasty, trailing behind DK Metcalf, right ahead of some of those win now guys like, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, etc. there. Jordan Addison is my wide receiver 18, just behind those win now guys, right ahead of Jerry Jeudy, Quentin Johnston, I believe Brandon Ayuk. And I mean, speaking of Quentin Johnston, he is my wide receiver 22 in my ranking. So like you said, ranging in terms of where they are at in terms of my wide receiver 2 rankings, Quentin Johnston barely cracking inside that top 24, whereas Jaxon Smith-Njigba, he is 1 spot from overtaking DK Metcalf and being considered my wide receiver 12, aka a wide receiver 1 in my rankings. So in terms of their draft capital, obviously we see in the NFL draft, Jaxon Smith-Njigba go to the Seattle Seahawks at the 20th overall pick, Jordan Addison going to the Minnesota Vikings at the 23rd overall pick, and Quentin Johnston going to the Los Angeles Chargers at the 21st overall pick. So as a whole, how do you feel about those landing spots? How do you feel in terms of their draft capital? Like, what do you see as their projection for some of these guys?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to rank the landing spots, given their skill set, I think Addison's was the best, QJ's was the second best, and then JSN's was the worst. But JSN also was the best prospect of these guys. And, at wide receiver, we always talk about wide receiver landing spots are usually overrated by the market. And especially when we look at JSN's, in year 1, is it going to be fireworks? Is he going to have a massive season? I would say probably not, because he is going to be playing, alongside Tyler Lockett, alongside DK Metcalf. He could still lead the team in targets, and it wouldn't really shock me because he was that good of a prospect. But for the most part, I think we expect him to probably have a good target share for a rookie, productive on his targets, that kind of thing. But the Seahawks have an out in Tyler Lockett's contract after this season. And I think Jaxon Smith-Njigba would then slide into like a full-time Z flanker, inside-outside type of role. And I think that's when he would become a really good option. I know Danny's probably thinking this as well. We saw the same exact career trajectory from CeeDee Lamb, his rookie season, playing alongside Michael Gallup and alongside Amari Cooper, who, again, was considered the wide receiver 1 in that class entering the draft, but a lot of people overreacted to the landing spot, took other players above him because, he had too many mouths to feed in that Cowboys offense.
Yeah, oddly enough, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Jaxon Smith-Njigba is like some type of composite between what Amon-Ra St. Brown represents versus what CeeDee Lamb represents. Amon-Ra St. Brown, if he's fully stuck as a slot, not really able to play on the outside of the next level, but he could still be a dominant slot. And obviously, if he takes that development, completely revamps his outside game, which we didn't really see a good sample of in college, he has the ceiling to be, top 5 wide receiver in Dynasty, where CeeDee Lamb kind of has vaulted up by his third year. So Jaxon Smith-Njigba, like you kind of said, first year, maybe he's only, 95, 100 targets, 900 receiving yards. You see the flashes at the end of the year, but he hasn't done it consistently because, again, Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf are there. But like you said, Tyler Lockett's probably gone after this year. Jaxon Smith-Njigba has a target volume, target earning type of profile. And outside of DK Metcalf, yeah, we know he's going to get his 130 targets or whatever. I wouldn't be shocked if JSN's the one actually leading the team in targets, given the profile and given where his targets will be coming from.
Yeah, I think we have a good sample knowing that he's competed with talented receivers as well, and actually led that Ohio State Buckeyes offense in yards, receptions, targets, all that stuff. So yeah, don't overthink JSN. To me, he's the clear 106 behind Jahmyr Gibbs, clear wide receiver 1 in my opinion. But I do think you can make the argument for these other two guys, which is why I think they're in the same tier. Jordan Addison goes to the Minnesota Vikings, like you said, 23rd overall, playing alongside Justin Jefferson. We know he's probably never going to be the wide receiver 1 on that team, just because Jefferson is, in my opinion, the best receiver in the entire league. A lock for 180 targets per season, probably will be the first overall pick in a lot of fantasy drafts this year from a redraft perspective, and in one quarterback dynasty leagues, I'm sure he's the first overall pick. So Addison finds himself in a landing spot where he's not going to be the number 1, but that's also kind of a good thing for him because he can work as the Z flanker, inside, outside, potentially work out of the slot most of the time. He's never going to see number 1 cornerbacks. And we saw what he did as the number 1 for the University of Pittsburgh as a true sophomore, 19-year-old, winning a Biletnikoff Award alongside Kenny Pickett. So if he's in that Kirk Cousins Minnesota Vikings offense, I think this offense is really going to shift from what was a run-first offense for a lot of years to a pass-first offense now with Jefferson, with Hawkinson, and with Jordan Addison, with Dalvin Cook getting up there in age, potentially cut or traded. So I think Addison is a very, very big winner of the NFL draft. I think this was one of the best landing spots he could have gone to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you kind of mentioned in terms of their personnel, in terms of exactly like what we can expect from their game plan, that they're going to lean more on the pass. I mean, we saw this past year, the previous 3 years of Kirk Cousins' career, so 2019 to 2021, obviously we know Kirk Cousins is going to be the sufficient quarterback, but in terms of overall volume, 444 attempts in 15 games, 516 attempts in 16 games, 561 in 16 games in 2021. We saw that number jump up to 643 pass attempts in 17 games last year with Kevin O'Connell, despite Adam Thielen being his wide receiver 2. KJ Osborne, while showing flashes, not really being a consistent, reliable, tertiary option in this offense. It was basically all Jefferson and all Hawkinson at tight end. Drafting a receiver at 23rd overall only indicates to me that 643 pass attempt mark is a good buffer for what the floor could be in this offense in terms of volume. I honestly think it's a similar situation. I mean, we compared JSN to kind of like the CeeDee Lamb outlook. I think Jordan Addison, while he may not have a top 5, top 7 overall ceiling in Dynasty by the market, because people are always going to point to, well, he's beside Justin Jefferson. How should we take a team's wide receiver 2? That impact is also going to affect his market value, which is why he's the clear 2, in my opinion. But if he has a Devontae Smith level breakout where, yeah, we know Justin Jefferson's going to earn 180, 190 targets, similar to what A.J. Brown represents for the Eagles, does not mean that this talented first-round player, great prospect wide receiver 2, is going to be isolated out of the offense. And similar to Devontae Smith, slender player, but plays a lot bigger than what the frame would suggest. So absolutely love Jordan Addison. I think he's the clear-cut wide receiver 2 for me. But again, if you're going to argue this next guy over him, I don't think that's bad as well, because Quentin Johnston got by far, like you mentioned, the perfect situation for what his skill set represents. I already talked about in the overall top 24 rankings just how valuable that role is getting added to this Chargers team. But the Chargers love throwing the ball across the yard. I would not be shocked if Justin Herbert, I mentioned with Kirk Cousins, 643 pass attempts last year, is going to have a high pass attempt barrier. I wouldn't be shocked if Justin Herbert was not only leading the NFL in terms of overall passing attempts, but doing so by a comfortable margin. I think this could be a similar situation to what we saw from your 2020 Bucs, where you're throwing the ball 750 times a year. Justin Herbert's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. You don't really have a very efficient rushing attack. As good of a receiver as Austin Eckler is, he is not the best in between the tackles runner. So as a result, they're going to scheme their offense around their strengths. They're going to scheme their offense around their quarterback. And Quentin Johnston's yards after catch skill set, learning the outside game by a guy from Mike Williams, who oddly enough was a very heralded prospect in his own right and has developed into a very fine outside wide receiver. If Quentin Johnston can develop his, play against press, overall route tree, being able to attack at all three levels of the field, he can be arguably the highest ceiling of this entire bunch, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the dynamic you want to get QJ involved in early in his career to get him to develop is get him on screens, get him on short bubble passes, jet sweeps kind of thing. Mike Williams is your downfield guy for the most part. Keenan Allen's the guy over the middle, and let QJ work as like your design touches plus downfield work complement to Mike Williams. And I think he can develop and have a pretty good rookie season as a result of that. So I like the landing spot for all these guys. I also think another comparison for Jordan Addison's situation is what we saw from Calvin Ridley in his rookie year, playing alongside Julio Jones, who obviously we expected Julio to be the number one, but maybe the long-term number one was Calvin Ridley. Obviously that's not going to happen because the Vikings are going to extend Justin Jefferson, but could he be the next, T Higgins and be still valued as a top 5 to 8 dynasty wide receiver, even though he's playing second fiddle to Jamar Chase? I think Jordan Addison absolutely has that kind of ceiling. The other guy that went in the first round was Zay Flowers, who is a tier behind these guys, mainly because he went to the Baltimore Ravens. And as much as I think the Baltimore Ravens landing spot is being over scrutinized because this isn't the same Ravens team, they're going to pass the ball more. They bring in Todd Monken. They get rid of Greg Roman. Lamar Jackson was extended. Bateman's coming back. They signed Odell Beckham Jr. They still have Mark Andrews. They're probably going to throw the ball a little bit more. I do think that Zay Flowers has a little bit more target competition because there's a stud target hog tight end there. And also if Beckham's healthy, he can still command targets, and Bateman commanded some targets in his spurts so far in his first 2 seasons. So it's a little bit less of a great landing spot, but I do think Zay Flowers is still a guy that I'm heavily targeting in the 109, 110, 111 sometimes area of rookie drafts. So I still really like him. I just think he's a little bit behind these guys. The reason those other guys are all in the same tier is because I wouldn't totally fault somebody for taking QJ wide receiver 1 or Addison wide receiver 1, but I would fault somebody for taking Zay Flowers wide receiver 1.
Yeah, no, I agree with exactly what you said. Although he was in that 4-stack bunch with these wide receivers, in my opinion, from a overall landing spot perspective, when we're talking about players that are selected in the same range, we do have to weigh some of these things in. And although we got the draft capital, like you kind of mentioned, we see the pros of the Baltimore situation. Todd Monken, extended Lamar Jackson. But in terms of year one, he kind of feels like a player that the dynasty market isn't as high on to begin with. So if he has a down year one with his target competition, there's a shot. It's like an Elijah Moore situation where, his value tanks. They're looking at Bateman. They're looking at Odell Beckham. They're looking at Mark Andrews and thinking, well, how is Lamar Jackson going to support all these guys long term? And having a bad year one, which Zay Flowers may have, is going to tank his value a lot in terms of the dynasty market. So not saying he's, any less talented than any of those guys in the top tier, but he's a lot more volatile of an asset. If you're taking him in your rookie drafts, he's a lot more risky of an asset given his feel on the market as opposed to QJ, as opposed to Addison, as opposed to JSN, who the market all love.
Yeah, not to mention you have Addison playing with a good quarterback, QJ playing with a great quarterback, pass-heavy offenses, and even though JSN's probably going to maybe not as pass-heavy as an offense as those guys, the dynasty market loved him coming into the draft, and they probably would give him a lot more leeway for having a bit more of a down rookie season than they would with Zay Flowers, who people were split on. Plus, people don't think Lamar Jackson's as good of a quarterback as those other 3 guys got, so definitely would make some sense. So let's get into the wide receiver 4 territory here, because this is a giant cluster of dudes. And the wide receivers to target and avoid video, a lot of you guys have been asking about that in the comment section. I will be dropping that Saturday. So if you want to know how these guys stack up like analytically and how their scores work, because that, for what it's worth, that exercise was quite accurate last year for both wide receivers and running backs. The guys that'll probably score well in that are Josh Downs, because we know his analytics profile was ironclad, target share, production, all that stuff.
Mims.
Which, again, if you recall from that video, production was the most predictive for wide receivers. Cedric Tillman, when you look, because I'm mostly looking at best season production, his 2021 season was quite good. So I'm sure he'll probably perform pretty well in that, as will Marvin Mims, who also had a good analytics profile, production profile. So that's kind of how those guys will perform. I'd imagine, again, I haven't actually recorded that video yet, so that might change a little bit. But when it comes to these guys, there's really a pick your poison tier. And I wouldn't blame anybody for saying Rashee Rice was wide receiver 5 in this class. I don't think he is. I think he has the worst profile of all those guys. But if you're just going to buy into the second round Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver, I don't think it's a terrible, process. I just personally wouldn't do it. I think this is where, dynasty players are going to be made and lost in this area of the draft, because there's probably going to be somebody who hits from here. I don't know who it's going to be. I don't know how big the hit's going to be. I don't know if it's going to be a wide receiver 1 in Dynasty or if it's going to be a wide receiver 2, 3 type in Dynasty. Maybe the best receiver from this area of the draft is Jahan Dotson, and that's the best case scenario. But if I'm going to bet on somebody, for me, it's going to be Josh Downs and Jayden Reed, and probably Cedric Tillman to some degree, because I really liked their profiles coming out. If you squint, especially in Reed and Tillman's case, you can make a very good argument for why they were actually a good profile. They just had some injuries and that kind of thing. So what are your thoughts on each of these guys? And then maybe we can kind of outline the bull and bear cases for each one.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating tier. Obviously, you got the quote unquote safer slot guys like, your Downs, your Reed, your Marvin, Mims, these smaller guys that have, better profiles, or like you kind of mentioned with Jayden Reed, you liked him better on tape versus, some of the outside guys that have more potential. Maybe a Jalin Hyatt, if he develops his route tree. Cedric Tillman obviously showed the flashes 2 years ago, kind of dealt with injuries, has the bad profile because he came out late. And then a guy like Jonathan Mingo, complete wild card because his profile is absolutely terrible. But like you mentioned, when you watched him, you did see those spurts of upside where he looked like quote unquote Walmart AJ Brown, which I think you actually said. So it is a very fascinating area to deal with. It just kind of depends, honestly, like what archetype of wide receiver are you looking for? What is your flavor? I personally have Downs the highest out of this group. You mentioned his profile is fantastic. He looks like a day one slot wide receiver in the NFL. And I do think in Indianapolis, he's going to have the opportunity to be that clear wide receiver 2 in terms of the target hierarchy. But I wouldn't fault anyone, like you said, for taking any of these guys in any order.
Yeah, and I'll give you guys a brief, synopsis of what the wide receivers to target and avoid video will be like. The best, the highest ranked traits that we're looking for out of wide receivers are, don't be slower than 4.6. Nobody in this tier was slower than 4.6, I believe. I think even Rashee Rice and Tillman both ran in the low 4.5, so we don't have that worry about any of these guys. The production-based metrics, best season yards per team pass attempt above 2.25, 83.93% of all the top 15 point per game scorers over the last 7 years or so. 83% of them had a yards per team pass attempt above 2.25. I know for a fact Jonathan Mingo does not clear that because he was not very productive. Again, target share above 22%. Mingo doesn't clear that. Dominator above 30%. The guys that clear that stuff production-wise were Downs, were Marvin Mims, I believe, cleared most of that stuff. And then, like I said, when you adjust some of the things, Tillman, Hyatt, and Jayden Reed have their upside cases from a production standpoint. The stuff that didn't matter as much that I think some of these guys are being over scrutinized for, only 62.5% of those wide receivers were early declares. So Cedric Tillman and Jayden Reed are two guys here, and Rashee Rice, who are not early declares. That definitely goes well in their favor, that a lot of these 40% of these top 15 seasons came from guys that were not early declares. Breakout age didn't really matter as much. That's good for Jalin Hyatt, who obviously had a late breakout. Age under 22 and a half on draft day. Again, I'm going a little bit rapid fire here, but I'm just giving you guys an idea of what kind of thresholds these guys meet. So for me, Josh Downs is the best profile, no doubt about it, in this area. Marvin Mims probably a close second from a pure profile standpoint, but I really liked what Jayden Reed did on film. And also when we account for the fact that reception perception really like Jayden Reed and Josh Downs, reception perception kind of like Cedric Tillman and Jonathan Mingo as well. You can make the bull case, the bear case for pretty much every one of these guys. The only ones that scare me really are Jonathan Mingo and Rashee Rice, because Mingo wasn't productive at all. Running 4.45 and being big didn't really matter that much. And Rashee Rice, his only pros are realistically that he went to Kansas City in the second round.
And the funny thing is, you mentioned those are the ones that scare you the most, Mingo or Rice. And they're probably the ones right now that are the most favored on the dynasty market, given what unfolded in the draft. Because, I mean, every single rankings video we put out thus far, people are like, well, why isn't Mingo a back-end first, early second-round pick for you guys? He went top 40 to Carolina, and they need a wide receiver 1. Or some people will be like, how do you not have Rashee Rice higher? He went to the Kansas City Chiefs. He's playing with Patrick Mahomes. It is so crazy how everybody can make any single argument for any of these guys being in any order. I said any quite a lot there, but it just kind of reiterates the fact that within this tier, once you're talking about wide receiver 4s, you kind of just pick your favorite profile. You kind of just pick your favorite spot there, and you hope one of them develops into a wide receiver 2 or potentially a high-end wide receiver 3.
Yeah, because like I said, it's possible that one of these guys hits big, none of these guys hit big, none of these guys hit period. Maybe 2 of these guys are wide receiver 3s in Dynasty. I don't anticipate a lot of these guys becoming alpha stud wide receiver 1s in Dynasty. But if I'm going to make my bet on who maybe becomes a wide receiver 3, it's going to be Josh Downs because he had the safest
100%.
profile, which is why he was my wide receiver 5. And I think people are overlooking him because he doesn't have that high of a ceiling, and that's fair. But the opposite side of the spectrum is none of these guys might hit at all. So give me the guy that at least hits a little bit, to the point that that he's a productive wide receiver for my dynasty team. I think this tier of wide receivers is going to make or break a lot of people's dynasty drafts. And I think my stance firmly right now is I'm going to lean on the history. I'm going to lean on the numbers. The numbers suggest that production matters, that, having good yards per team pass attempt in college, being faster than 4.6, best season target share above 22%, college dominator above 30%. The guys that applies to most is Downs, is Reed in his best season, Tillman in his best season, Marvin Mims in their best season. The guys that have the shiny landing spots, the shiny draft capital only mattered to a certain degree, and landing spot and that kind of thing we know doesn't matter as much for wide receivers. So for me, I'm firmly going to be above the camp of Downs, Tillman, these guys over Jonathan Mingo and Rashee Rice, even though the market, like you said, probably prefers those other guys. And that might be the crucial market mistake that separates our drafts from the market's drafts. But again, we could be wrong about that. Maybe those guys develop and maybe they hit, because I do agree that Mingo has a pretty high ceiling if he can develop, and Rashee Rice has a pretty high ceiling if he can develop as well. I just don't think that them developing is a likely scenario.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. The question I have for you, and it's a hypothetical, of course, but if I had to ask you right now that within the next 3 years, one of these guys in this range is going to be valued as a top 25 dynasty wide receiver, would you take the bet or would you say no?
25? I would take the bet that Downs becomes a top 25 dynasty wide receiver. If you said 15, I would not take the bet.
Yeah.
But I think Downs can become what Jahan Dotson has become, which is, he's a top 25 dynasty wide receiver. Is Jahan Dotson ever going to be a top 15 dynasty wide receiver? I don't know. Maybe if he has a great season this year, but I think he would have to prove quite a bit in that case. Josh Downs has the profile to suggest that he's a target earner at the next level. If Anthony Richardson is better than people think, then Josh Downs can become absolutely a top 25 dynasty wide receiver.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. And actually, oddly enough, Josh Downs would be my favorite bet from this bunch as well. Hence, when we went through our overall rankings, I believe he was our consensus 204 in our drafts.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting, too, that even though Mingo went first of this bunch, 39th overall, all of these guys got day 2 draft capital. So it's not like any of these guys you're going to favor over the other just because they went higher in the draft. They all went on day 2. And yeah, you'd prefer a second-round receiver to a third-round receiver. But generally speaking, there's not a huge difference hit rate-wise historically between second-round wide receivers and third-round wide receivers, especially with the added context that Mingo wasn't a good prospect, on film and in the numbers. So a second-round pick can only go so far if you're a bad prospect and had bad film. Same goes for Rashee Rice. So this tier is interesting, man. Pick your poison. Like I said, whoever you like, go after them. For me, that'll be Downs. That'll be Reed. That'll probably be Tillman, given where I see him falling to, and Marvin Mims to some degree as well. Because I see Hyatt going pretty high still. I see Mingo going really high, and I see Rashee Rice going really high. So I'm probably going to avoid those 3 guys. But for the most part, pick your poison in this tier. If you like them, by all means, go after them.
Yeah, the last thing I would say in terms of that tier, like we kind of mentioned, order in any way, my only slight differences would be I would have Mims closer to the left side, probably right after Downs for me personally. And then, other than that, I think it's pretty nail on. So I think we pretty much cover this tier. Obviously, a lot of them have some warts in their profile. Maybe, they don't have quite the ceiling, some of them, or in terms of the others that have the ceiling have, potential out of the league type of floor, like with Rashee Rice and Jonathan Mingo. So it's just kind of a pick your poison area. We can move on to the dart throws, though. I'd also add Tyler Scott to this list, but in terms of dart throws, it's exactly what it says. It is a dart throw. You are in the 4th round of your rookie draft. Maybe you're in a best ball, or maybe you just want some youth to add to the team. I don't know. Maybe you're a rebuilder and want to potentially take the shot on an athletic player, outperforming their draft capital. This is basically the area to do it. Trey Palmer, you kind of mentioned, Tampa Bay Buccaneer. Actually, oddly enough, I believe you guys selected him, round 6? And he was a guy that was ranked as a 3rd-round grade in your personal grade. So I'll let you take it away with him.
Yeah, Palmer has an interesting skill set. My comp for him was Kenny Stills. So again, in a best ball format or just, spike week potential, I think he could be a decent, wide receiver 6 for a contending roster, wide receiver 7 for a contending roster, maybe in a good matchup. If they're playing a bad defense, you could throw him in there and hope that he catches a long touchdown or something because he's got 4.3 speed and he works on the outside primarily. So he's interesting, but again, 6th round draft capital can only go so far. So that's why he's a dart throw, and you should only take him probably in the 4th round of a rookie draft. Tank Dell is just so small, man. Like, I get it. He's like pretty productive and, you know, he is a decent route runner, but at the same time, 3rd round draft capital can only go so far when you're like 160 pounds. Tutu Atwell went in the 2nd round, and nobody's excited that they drafted Tutu Atwell and bought into the draft capital. So Tank Dell in the 4th round, fine, but I'm probably not going to take him any higher than that. Kayshon Boutte, once thought of as potentially in that tier up with JSN and Jordan Addison and Quentin Johnston. People thought Kayshon Boutte would be right there with those guys. Attitude concerns, work ethic concerns, whatever you want to call them. He didn't test as well as we thought. He wasn't as big as we thought. He wasn't as productive as we thought he was going to be after his freshman year. Maybe the Patriots can fix it. Maybe they're the one team that gets the best out of him, and that's potentially why they took the shot on him. And I think there's probably a pretty decent landing spot for him, because if he develops, there's nobody really to compete for targets with on that offense. He's a fine dart throw again in the 4th round, but I'm not going to take him, you know, much higher than that. The 310 maybe is like the highest that I would take him. And then Michael Wilson, so many injuries throughout his college career, but a lot of film guys confirm that this guy is potentially a good route runner. Whatever, man. He didn't produce that much. Production's the most important thing, but he did get 3rd round draft capital, which means he might have the opportunity to get on the field for the Cardinals there, especially if they trade DeAndre Hopkins. So I have him at wide receiver 15, but I'm not really excited about anybody from this tier.
Yeah, no, I agree as well. I briefly touching upon Tank Dell. Obviously, it's interesting. They have really no set it and forget it type of targets over there in Houston. Obviously, we like the upside of Mechie. Obviously, Colin showed some signs last year, so he could be fascinating, potentially competing for targets with those guys. Not to mention, CJ Stroud was the one that actually asked the Texans brass, "Hey, if we're gonna walk away with a weapon in this draft, I want Tank Dell in the 3rd round." So they listened to him. So maybe that's an interesting plot line. But like you kind of said, he is like the Deuce Vaughn of wide receivers. Like, we're talking about a very, very small guy over here. And if he had this type of profile and he was, you know, even Marvin Mims size, even, you know, Jayden Reed size, like, we're looking at a guy that would quite easily be in the wide receiver 4 area. But I believe he weighed in at what, 5'7", 5'8", 160 pounds. Like that's a feather.
Yeah, it's a feather, and I would argue that Deuce Vaughn's a better player at his position than
Yeah.
Tank Dell is at his position, and we're having all these question marks about both of these guys. So yeah, take a shot on Tank Dell, but I'm not super excited about him. So anybody else that we missed that you want to just briefly mention? I mean, Dontavian Wicks was a guy that I kind of liked on film. He went to the Packers, I believe, in the 5th round of the draft. And we also had you know, some other guys. Parker Washington went day 3 to the Jags. Xavier Hutchinson also goes to the Texans late in the draft as well. Anybody else that you wanted to mention?
I mean, you pretty much covered it. Tyler Scott's probably the most interesting one out of those guys, and actually a guy I would have in this dart throw area, simply because of the opportunity there, right? He is the speed wide receiver. They're not attached to Claypool long term. We understand that DJ Moore is going to be the long-term earner of targets on that team. I do think that, you know, whether it's Darnell Mooney playing second fiddle, outside of those 2 guys, realistically, there's an opportunity for him to potentially earn snaps. And given his profile, again, he's more of a better in best ball type of player where maybe he catches a long touchdown and you could flip him for a 3 at some point.
Yeah, Tyler Scott's definitely interesting. He was, I believe, one of the first receivers off the board in the 4th round. So that's definitely interesting for him. So a lot of wide receivers in this class, not a lot of them good. So that's definitely the downside. But if you're in the 2nd round, take a shot on some of these wide receiver 4s. Take a shot on some of these wide receiver 4s in the 3rd round, especially if they fall to you. Because I got Tillman, I believe, at 305 in one of my leagues and Hyatt at 304, which I'm totally fine with that kind of value, because even though they have warts in their profile, there is upside cases that Jalin Hyatt becomes, you know, Will Fuller, or Cedric Tillman becomes Cortland Sutton or something like that. And if you get those guys in the 3rd round of a rookie draft, then that could definitely pay off for you. So definitely feel free to tune into the wide receivers to target and avoid video that's coming out Saturday. I will have a much more organized way of saying that Downs was a good bet and that kind of thing. I kind of just went off the cuff as I prepared the sheet for that video later today. So definitely stay tuned for that video. Running backs to target and avoid will be live tomorrow on the channel. Danny will have a video later today talking about exploiting market value in rookie drafts that you definitely should pay attention to as well. And then, of course, Friday night, probably late 10, 11 p.m. Eastern time, I will be going live doing some best ball drafts. And then Saturday afternoon, I'll be doing the same thing because I will be in Quebec, not in Ontario, where I can actually get in some Best Ball Mania 4 drafts. And if you guys want to join in on the fun, $25 entries, you get your shot at $3 million to first, $15 million in total prizes, in-season prizes out the wazoo this year, including $500K to the regular season champion. Definitely check out Underdog Fantasy and use the promo code FSE when you sign up. You'll get 100% back on whatever you put in. So if you want to do a bunch of Best Ball Mania drafts and you want to sign up with $100, that gives you 4 entries. You'll also get an additional free 4 entries for using our promo code as well. So definitely stay tuned for everything we got going on with Best Ball. We will definitely be ripping some of those drafts in this Best Ball season coming up. So definitely check all that stuff out. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.